When Sears or JCPenney closes a location, most people think it's a death sentence for the mall. They picture empty parking lots, declining traffic, tenants leaving, the whole thing slowly unraveling. But here's what actually happens. Those anchor tenants were paying somewhere close to nothing, a couple dollars a foot, $2, $3 a foot in rent, deals that were negotiated decades ago under a completely different retail environment. We step in, take that same box, subdivide it, re-tenant it, and suddenly you've got 3, 4, sometimes 5 tenants paying $15, $20, even $25 a foot. And just like that, the NOI in that space just doesn't improve, it multiplies. The worst thing that happened to the mall just became the best thing. I realize that statement sounds counterintuitive. A major anchor leaves, and that's good news. Let me explain, because this is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in retail real estate, and it's the core of how we actually create value. To understand the opportunity, you have to understand the history. Those legacy department stores were actually terrible tenants from a revenue perspective. Sears, Penny's, Macy's. They signed 30-year leases back in the 80s and 90s at $2, $3 a foot. They paid almost nothing. They still pay nothing. Department stores were never meant to be a profit center for landlords. They were meant to be traffic drivers. Back in the 70s and 80s, malls were built around these anchors. Landlords would give them incredibly favorable terms, below market rent, long-term control, sometimes even ownership of the land and building itself. Because the assumption was that these stores would pull in customers who would then shop the smaller inline tenants. So you ended up with these massive boxes sitting on some of the best real estate in the entire property, generating very little income relative to their size. On paper, it looked stable. It looked like strong tenancy. It gave the illusion of security, but economically, it was inefficient. In many cases, that 150,000 square foot box was producing less income than a fraction of that space would if it were leased at market rates. So when that tenant leaves, it feels like a loss, but in reality, you're finally getting the chance to unlock value that's been suppressed for decades. By 2020, Sears wasn't pulling foot traffic in anymore. Nobody was going to the mall because of Sears. They were going despite Sears. That anchor was occupying 150,000 square feet, paying almost nothing, contributing almost no foot traffic. When they finally left, you get back a massive box that you can now release at actual market rents. Now, when a department store goes dark, there's a short-term shock. Traffic dips a bit, perception shifts a little bit, other tenants get a bit nervous. But if you zoom out and look at it through an investment lens, what just happened is incredibly powerful. You just regained control of a massive piece of real estate that was underperforming, underleased, and structurally misaligned with today's consumer behavior. It's not just square footage. It's flexibility, it's optionality, it's the ability to rethink what that space should be in today's world, not what it was designed to be 40 years ago. And that's where experienced operators separate themselves from everyone else. Most people, they see a problem, try to stabilize it. The right approach is to step back, reassess, and completely reposition it. There's really 3 primary ways to approach a vacant department store box, and the best operators don't just pick one, they evaluate all 3, and then they decide which mix creates the most value for that specific property. The first path is subdivision into smaller format retail, where you take that large single-tenant space, you break it into multiple demised units, allowing you to bring in a mix of off-price retailers, specialty concepts, apparel, and other users that are still performing well in today's environment. Bring in a Dick's Sporting Goods, a Burlington, maybe Home Goods. Each pays $15 to $25 per square foot. Total rent from that footprint goes from $200,000 a year to $1.5 million to $2 million. And instead of relying on one tenant paying below market rent, you're creating a diversified rent roll with multiple tenants paying significantly higher rates, which not only increases income, but it also reduces risk because you're no longer dependent on one single operator. The second path is converting the space into entertainment or fitness uses, which is less about maximizing rent per foot, more about driving traffic and engagement. These tenants want 20, 30, 50,000 square feet. They draw evening, weekend traffic, and they're completely immune to e-commerce. Uses like gyms, family entertainment centers, experiential concepts, and even modern cinema formats bring people to the property more frequently. They stay longer, they create energy that spills over into the rest of the tenant base. In many cases, this type of tenant becomes the new anchor, not because of the rent they pay, but because of the behavior and traffic they generate. The third path, and often the most transformative, is converting the space into non-retail uses entirely, which could mean residential, multifamily, medical, educational, municipal, office-type tenants. This is where you start to fundamentally redefine what the property is. A former department store becomes an urgent care center, a DMV, a community college satellite campus, or even a call center, bringing in daily traffic that's needs-based rather than discretionary. These tenants may operate differently than traditional retail, but they provide stability, consistency, and relevance in a way that pure retail often can't. One of the most important insights in all of this is counterintuitive. The goal is not always to replace retail with more retail. In fact, some of the best performing properties today have less traditional retail than they did a decade ago. Sometimes you need to shrink that retail. You need to add alternative uses. The building doesn't have to be 100% stores. What they have instead is a more balanced ecosystem, where shopping is just one component of a broader mix that includes services, healthcare, fitness, entertainment, and community-oriented uses. By shrinking the amount of pure retail and introducing these complementary uses, you're increasing the frequency of visits. You're diversifying the reasons people come to the property, and you're making the asset more resilient to changes in consumer behavior. You're no longer dependent on someone deciding to go shopping. You're becoming part of their routine. And that shift from discretionary visits to habitual visits is what ultimately stabilizes and strengthens the asset. There's a bigger theme underneath all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. These redevelopments are increasingly filling gaps that cities and municipalities can't address on their own. Local governments often don't have the capital, the speed, the staff, the ability to take on the risk required to develop new infrastructure, whether that's healthcare facilities, public services, or community spaces. So what's happening is that private capital, guys like us, are turning dead anchor boxes into the new American town square, not necessarily because we set out to be civic developers, but because the economics make sense when you reposition these large, underutilized assets. And in doing so, they end up creating something much more impactful. A vacant Sears box turns into an urgent care center that serves thousands of people. A former department store becomes a DMV that reduces congestion elsewhere in the city. An empty anchor is transformed into an indoor recreational space that gives families a place to gather. What was once a purely retail environment evolves into something closer to a modern town center, a place where people just don't shop, but solve problems, access services, and spend time. It's private equity acting in many ways as a form of civic infrastructure. Now, None of this happens overnight. There's a tendency to think you can just replace a tenant and move on. But backfilling a department store is a complex, multi-phase process that typically takes 12 to 18 to 24 months. When you're dealing with demolition, reconfiguration of the space, new demising walls, updated systems, leasing negotiations, permitting, construction, and coordination across multiple tenants, all of which takes time and capital. It requires patience, it requires conviction, and it requires a clear vision for what the end product should be. But that's exactly why the opportunity exists in the first place, because not everyone is willing or able to execute at that level. So the next time you hear that a Sears or Penney's is closed, and the narrative is that the mall's in trouble, take a step back and look at it differently. What you're really seeing is a moment where decades-old constraints have finally been removed, where mispriced space has been reset, and where a skilled operator has a chance to completely transform the economics of the property. In this business, value isn't created by avoiding problems. It's created by recognizing when something that looks like a problem is actually an opportunity in disguise, and having the discipline to execute upon that opportunity. Because if you do it right, that empty box doesn't drag the property down. It becomes the engine that drives it forward.